Impeachment battle.
When I read the 20 articles of impeachment, my first thought were these are worthless and weak.
The lead lawyer for suspended Attorney General Ken Paxton says his client is innocent and the case against him is flawed. But the attorneys who will prosecute Paxton during the upcoming trial in the Senate tell a different story.
The people of the state of Texas are entitled to know whether their top cop is a crook.
Impasse. Governor Greg Abbott and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick stand their ground and dig in their heels at the Texas Capitol as their standoff continues over how best to lower your property tax bill.
I'll call special session after special session after special session until a solution is reached.
That's a negotiation that we are not backing down from ever in the Senate.
And the field of Republicans running for the White House continues to grow. We'll break down the GOP primary fight.
There's dissatisfaction among the GOP electorate.
I'm Jack Fink. Get your fix for Texas politics. Eye on Politics on CBS News Texas starts right now. We begin with the battle over the impeachment of Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton. This week, his attorneys said he is innocent, and they don't believe the evidence against him is strong at all. It will be up to Texas senators to listen and weigh all of the evidence against Paxton and decide if he should be removed as Attorney General permanently. Paxton has been suspended without pay ever since the Texas House impeached him Memorial Day weekend. He's accused of abusing his office and power so he could help himself and a campaign donor. Among the 20 articles of impeachment, abuse of public trust, being unfit for office, dereliction of duty, and constitutional bribery. Attorneys who will be prosecuting the case spoke at a news conference last week. As for Paxton, he and his lawyers have strongly denied he did anything wrong.
Impeachment articles that have been laid out by the House are baloney. Just so we're clear, the allegations are untrue. They are false. When I read the 20 articles of impeachment, my first thought were these are worthless and weak.
This is not about a one-time misuse of an office. It's not about a two-time misuse of the office. It's about a pattern of misconduct and using the office, subjecting to people who don't have a voice to basically threats and fear that if they come forward, they will pay a big price for it.
Paxton's attorneys held their news conference Wednesday at the Texas Republican Party headquarters. A party spokesman says its office is open to all elected Republicans. The impeachment trial will start by August 28th, but senators will soon decide an exact date along with the rules and procedures for the trial. No word yet if Paxton's wife, Senator Angela Paxton of McKinney, will recuse herself. Now to the other big story reverberating around the Texas Capitol, the ongoing public showdown between Governor Greg Abbott and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick over how best to reduce your property taxes. Neither is backing down. Both are standing their ground. Lawmakers have already agreed to provide property owners $17.6 billion in relief, more than half of the state's budget surplus. But until the House and Senate pass the same exact bill, you and other homeowners and business owners are not going to see lower property tax bills. Here's a closer look at how the proposals break down. The details are on your screen. Under the bill passed by the House and backed by Governor Abbott, the state would reduce property taxes that are used to pay for public schools and instead use more state funding such as the sales tax and surplus money. Their plan is to keep doing that until the school district's maintenance and operations, or M&O portion of your property tax bill, is reduced to zero over a 10-year period. The Senate plan also includes a provision to reduce the amount of property taxes and increase state sales tax to pay for public schools. And it would also increase the homestead exemption for homeowners and nearly double their savings, at least starting out. Governor Abbott, though, has said the state has tried this strategy before.
But no one has really felt the benefit of that for one simple reason. Because of inflation of values of homes, that erodes the value set of a homestead exemption. What taxpayers would benefit from even more is a complete elimination of that property tax rate altogether.
People say, well, Dan, can't you negotiate? Well, I think that's negotiating. You want 100%, we'll give you 70, give the homeowners 30. That's a negotiation that we are not backing down from ever in the Senate.
The lieutenant governor said the school property tax cannot be eliminated, despite what the governor and others say. And Governor Abbott said that until there's a solution, he'll keep calling lawmakers back for special session after special session until they provide property tax relief to Texans. Now to the road to the White House and the growing field of Republican candidates running to become president. This week, former Vice President Mike Pence, former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, and North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum threw their political hats into the ring. And Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and former South Carolina Governor and U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, brought their campaigns to North Texas.
Now is the time to realize that energy security is national security.
In West Texas, Nikki Haley championed the oil and gas industry and vowed to increase U.S. energy production.
First, we're going to stop demonizing energy producers, and we're going to empower them to go and help us.
UT Arlington political science professor Rebecca Dean says Haley's visit to West Texas is telling.
That tells me that she's trying to solidify her bona fides among the most conservative in the GOP electorate.
Haley's visit there came after she raised money in Dallas Wednesday night. Ron DeSantis also attended a fundraiser in downtown Fort Worth, where we saw him leaving, and then went to another event at this Dallas home Thursday. They're among the 10 Republican candidates, also including former President Donald Trump, his former Vice President Mike Pence, South Carolina Senator Tim Scott, and former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie.
There's dissatisfaction among the GOP electorate. It is interesting that a former president is garnering so many opponents.
Christie is going after Trump.
A lonely, self-consumed, self-serving mirror hog is not a leader.
But it was a very different story in Fort Worth in 2016 when Christie dropped out of the Republican primary and backed Trump. We spoke with both of them.
To me, it's so significant. He's top, absolutely top.
Why are you endorsing Mr. Trump?
He's the best man to lead America back to greatness.
Now, the latest Texas GOP primary poll shows Trump with a big lead at 47%. DeSantis has 23%, and Pence, Scott, and Haley are in the low single digits.
It's too soon to take any one poll terribly seriously, but trend lines, I think, are telling. And so it is telling that President Trump, former President Trump, has this clear advantage.
Coming up, we'll take a deeper dive into the Republican presidential primary with UT Arlington political science professor Rebecca Dean. And later, 2 members of Congress from North Texas explain their votes to raise the debt ceiling and cut the federal budget. Eye on Politics on CBS News Texas. We'll be right back. Welcome back. The Republican primary for president is expanding and heating up, and candidates hoping to make it to the White House are making stops along the way in Texas, as they often do. We spoke with UT Arlington political science professor Dr. Rebecca Dean. So here we are, and the presidential race, at least on the Republican side, is heating up. It's getting interesting. Former Vice President Mike Pence is jumping into the race this week, and former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie is jumping into the race. And so what do you make of this, and how will this impact the growing Republican field?
Well, it's very interesting. And I think the first thing that it indicates is that, excuse me, although former President Trump is polling the best among all of these either announced candidates or potential candidates, there's dissatisfaction among the GOP electorate, and certainly within those who might want to put their hat into the ring. It is interesting that a former president is garnering so many opponents.
And why do you think that is? I mean, you talked a little bit about the dissatisfaction. What's the dissatisfaction over in your estimation?
Well, we've always known that he had a hard ceiling. He won the GOP nomination in 2016, largely because of the crowded field. He was able to move his way through that season in a way that knocked down his opponents. And there were so many of them that mathematically it was easier for him to move through that process. And then, of course, his actions in office were not universally applauded. Certainly, he engendered quite a bit of dissatisfaction among independents and certainly among Democrats. And then we can't overlook his scandals and the investigations that he's under and potential indictments to come down. So I think there's a myriad of things from both his historic polling numbers as well as the events post-presidency. And then, of course, we can't overlook January 6th. So I think there's just a number of things that pull down his favorability ratings.
And I want to get into all those things that you mentioned a little bit, but I wanted to ask you about Texas. And, obviously you cannot win the White House without winning Texas. And you have two candidates fundraising in North Texas this week, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and former governor and secretary of the UN under President Trump, Nikki Haley. And so what do you make of the fact that they're coming to Texas doing fundraising trips? Nikki Haley's holding a news conference in West Texas, but not Governor DeSantis.
Well, I think each of them is motivated by a variety of things unique to their campaign. First of all, Texas has deep pockets. And so their viable candidates are going to make swings through here for fundraising, not only for garnering the actual money, the actual funds, but also to increase their cachet among that donor elite. So the fact that they're coming through doesn't surprise me. Also, both of those two candidates have been a part of smaller meetings with groups that whose influence is significant. For example, both of them, as well as former Vice President Pence, were part of a meeting back in the spring with the Club for Growth, who did not invite former President Trump to that meeting. So those sorts of things indicate that they are real contenders. Now, certainly Governor DeSantis has the strongest polling numbers of those who would challenge former President Trump. But even Secretary Haley, former Governor Haley, has attracted interest among the GOP. So it doesn't surprise me that they're attracting fundraising. It doesn't surprise me that they're coming to North Texas. Now, what is interesting, I think, is that former Governor Haley is going to West Texas. That tells me that she's trying to solidify her bona fides among the most conservative in the GOP electorate. She really had kind of been running, at least initially, folks tended to see her in social conservatism, but with real foreign policy chops. And so this tells me that she's trying to shore up some of that support. She's not as inherently confrontational as Governor DeSantis. And so I think, each of these, we use this analogy a lot, right? When there's a crowded field, we talk about lanes. And so each of them is trying to figure out what his or her lane is going to be in this election.
And let me ask you, because, there's a new poll out today in Texas, and it shows, Trump way ahead of everybody, which mirrors the national polls, as you mentioned before. And so I'm wondering, aren't all these polls really premature until we have the first debate? Because everybody's going to want to know, how does DeSantis react to Trump when Trump goes after him, if Trump takes part in this debate? But I always say, well, why wouldn't he want to take part of it? Because that's where all the attention is going to be. So what do you make of all that?
Yeah, I think you're right. Absolutely. That it's very early. I heard it described as late early. So it would be pretty unrealistic for someone who, we hadn't even had on our radar to jump into the field now, right? So it's late in that sense, but there's a lot of ground between now and even when the first contest is held, beginning of next calendar year. So you're right, it's too soon to take any one poll terribly seriously, but trend lines, I think, are telling. And so it is telling that President Trump, former President Trump, has this clear advantage. But as you allude to here, a lot of it's got to be name recognition. So I think that as we hear from these candidates more, and as the debate, I think the GOP has set that debate in August. As that happens, we'll learn more. Now, what's interesting about the actual debate itself is the Republican National Committee has 3 guiding principles for whether folks can even show up on the stage. One is polling, one is fundraising, not only in hard dollar amounts, but also breadth of support. And the other is that they have to sign a pledge that they will support whoever the nominee is. And it's that last piece that's gotten a lot of attention. So, we'll see who's eligible for the debate when August rolls around. Now, as to whether or not former President Trump chooses to participate, I mean, goodness gracious, your guess is as good as mine. I mean, on the one hand, I think that, as you say, why not? On the other hand, front runners, traditional frontrunners, which I don't think we would call former President Trump traditional in most ways, but traditional frontrunners don't want to do things that could run them into trouble, right? They're risk averse because they're trying to protect a lead. Will former President Trump behave that way? I don't know. He does want to be where the attention is. On the other hand, all the arrows will be aimed at him.
And how do candidates, because one thing that we hear when you talk to Republicans, they like for the former president's policies. They could do without the tweets, et cetera. And so how does another candidate go after the president and try to, attract voters? How do they do that? Because, I've heard that, they don't want to be disrespectful to a former president in the office, but at the same time, attract people and make themselves more viable.
Well, that's really interesting. And I think that's where you see some of the differences, certainly in style and approach among these candidates. So you've got Senator Jim Scott from South Carolina, another South Carolinian who is trying to echo sort of a Ronald Reagan happy warrior type, certainly very conservative, certainly had voted in line with President Trump during that administration. Then you have former Vice President Pence, who's trying to be, the elder statesman here. And then you have Governor DeSantis, who's trying to be like President Trump in style, but even more to the right of him. He's going after him as not being conservative enough on things like abortion and the COVID restrictions. So it is really interesting to see how each of these candidates are trying to attract his supporters, former President Trump's supporters on policy, and then to differentiate themselves in terms of the kind of president that he or she would be.
You mentioned before the fact that there are a lot of investigations into former President Trump, relates to January 6th, relates to presidential records, the Georgia investigation about interfering in their election in 2020, and also in New York State. And so I'm wondering what impact, if he is to be indicted, would that have on the race and on his candidacy?
I think it depends on which one of those hits. All right. So you had a conviction on a civil case for sexual misconduct and abuse. And I think that many voters, while they might view that as abhorrent, that's sort of a known to them, right? If they were a Trump supporter, then that was something that wasn't going to be disqualifying, that sort of behavior. I think that election interference perhaps is in a separate category. So it will depend on which of those investigations would land with an indictment. I think it does matter if it's a federal indictment versus a state indictment. I think it's, even though the federal indictment, former President Trump could cast that as, Biden administration Democrats going after him. do think perhaps voters might weigh a federal indictment differently than they would a state or a city indictment.
And so that could potentially harm him, depending on what the charge is, et cetera.
Yeah, depending on what the charge is, depending on when it lands also. And you know, former President Trump is really adept at being able to not have things that would have torpedoed an ordinary politician seem to pierce the armor.
And you talked before about the loyal people who are very loyal to former President Trump. And what would it take in your mind for people to say, all right, we just need to cut the cord and move forward and back somebody else?
I don't know the answer to that, Jack. You know, I think that there's a core there who have been with him through thick and thin and continue to be with him. I think those who have peeled away already have peeled away, and I've seen some of that support go to Governor DeSantis, and some of it is sort of a wait and see, right? I think there's a lot of potential in the polling numbers for movement, so I certainly wouldn't want to make a prediction today that would be set in stone, but there is a core that just stays with him.
And to your point, as far as some of the Republicans who we've heard from say, you know, this shows all of the, you know, all these investigations are politically motivated to try to sideline him, try to get him out of the picture. And his supporters say, this makes us support him even more. What do you make of that?
Well, it makes sense. I mean, so if you think about the way that individuals form opinions and have those opinions reinforced, if you are committed to your position, people trying to dissuade you of that opinion only reinforces your opinion more. So I don't find that trend to be particularly surprising.
Dr. Rebecca Dean from UT Arlington, thank you so much. We really appreciate your insight as always.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Coming up, we'll go to Capitol Hill and speak with two members of Congress from North Texas. They voted differently on the deal to raise the debt ceiling and cut spending. Eye on Politics on CBS News Texas returns in a moment. A majority of Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill voted to raise the U.S. debt ceiling and cut the federal budget. Even so, a bipartisan group of lawmakers voted against it. We spoke with two congressmen, Republican Pat Fallon, but we'll begin with Democrat Mark Vesey. You recently voted for the debt ceiling and budget cut deal. Why was that important to you to vote for that?
Oh, that was very important to vote for. I think that any member of Congress, regardless of party, that cares about people's life savings, their 401ks, their 529 college plans, and just the economy in general, voted yes for raising the debt ceiling. I thought it was an easy vote. It would have been an economic catastrophe. They were predicting unemployment rates as high as 10.5% had we not raised the debt ceiling. And so for me, it's easy. All industrialized countries have raised the debt ceiling, and sometimes they actually have the ceiling so high that they don't even have these problems. And we need to probably look at doing away with even having a debt ceiling. One of the bankers at one of the largest banks in the country, JP Morgan Chase, yesterday, said that much himself. Jamie Dimon said that we should be looking at getting rid of it, and I think that he knows something about the economy. And so, let's move away from this. The politics around this is silly, to be quite frank with you, and we need to move on. We need to turn the page.
So let me ask you, because there were Republicans who voted for this. There were Republicans who voted against this. There were Democrats such as yourself who voted for it. There were Democrats who voted against this. So what do you make of this bipartisan disagreement? I mean, this wasn't just one party, voting one way.
Yeah, the problem that I have with the reckless radical Republicans that voted no on this is that they were willing to take down the economy just because of their philosophy that you should never raise the debt ceiling. And I think that that's absolutely ridiculous for them to brag about taking the country, hostage and saying that no way are we ever going to raise the debt ceiling under any circumstances. And that sort of inflexibility, that sort of attitude, that sort of marriage to one's philosophy is something that I think that the average Texan, that the average American is sick and tired of. Those sort of partisan politics, they want to see us come together and get things done. And so.
But Democrats voted against this as well.
Yeah, and like I was saying, some of there were Democrats that voted against it. I will acknowledge that. But I think that for Republicans that voted no on this, it's because they never want to raise the debt ceiling. And if you're going to have people in leadership positions in the majority that are going to hold the country hostage, which is with their very own words, then we have to worry about what our economy is always going to look like every year, and that just shouldn't be the case. It's not a way to run an industrialized country, and it's not a good look for Republicans to just say no, to be saying no.
How concerned are you about the debt? I mean, if, let's say, Jamie Dimon's comments yesterday about not having a debt ceiling at all, that spending will just, continue unchecked.
No, I think that I'm not worried about that at all. I think that with the Inflation Reduction Act that President Biden put into place, that there's clearly mechanisms in there that's going to help us bring down our nation's debt. And I think that there are tactics that you should use like that make a lot more sense other than, again, as the Republicans said, holding the country hostage. People's savings, their 401ks, their college plans cannot withstand that sort of philosophy and that sort of extremism. And again, we need to look at something that is more sustainable, because doing this every year is absolutely not.
Let me ask you about because just going forward, the bill passed, and so the president signed it into law. Going forward, we've heard for years discussion about having a balanced budget amendment. What's your thought about that?
I'm not saying that I oppose the balanced budget amendment. What I'm saying is that based on my experience here, again, I was elected I was sworn in 2013. So, I've been here just a little over 10 years now. And in my experience, things like sequester and things where you really confine the Congress from being able to make tough decisions and do their jobs has not been good for the economy, particularly good for the local Dallas-Fort Worth economy. And so I would be hesitant into going into any sort of pledges or balanced budget amendments without knowing all of the facts and details about what it's going to do when Congress actually needs some flexibility to be able to make its mind up on how to lead the country in the right direction.
I wanted to ask you about Speaker McCarthy. I know that some Republicans, some conservatives are expressing concerns just about this whole budget deal that was passed last week. And so do you think he's in trouble?
Yeah, that's interesting. Republicans had to put their gas stove bill on the back burner yesterday because they couldn't get the rule passed. And, as you know, Jack, getting the rule passed is something that's very routine around here. The majority party always gets their rule passed. And then, of course, people can vote whatever way they want to once the bill makes it to the House floor. But that was the first time in over 20 years that a rule has gone down in flames. And it shows that Kevin McCarthy, he made a deal, again, with the most reckless radical Republicans in his conference to become speaker. And now they're going to, hold him accountable. And that's what happens when you make deals with people like that. It was payback. What happened yesterday was payback for the bipartisan vote to raise the debt ceiling. And there's no other way around that. I'm not sure how he's going to function as a as a speaker that can get things done and be able to negotiate with both sides, as speakers have to be able to do, because these people are going to, like they said, they're going to hold the country's economy hostage. They're going to hold his speakership hostage.
I wanted to ask you one last question, and I appreciate your time, Congressman. As far as Speaker McCarthy, he is now saying that the Republicans Congress may hold FBI Director Christopher Wray in contempt over this document from a confidential, credible source as it relates to Joe Biden as vice president allegedly taking a $5 million bribe from a foreign national. What's your reaction to all this?
I haven't really heard much about that, but to me, it sounds like another one of the Republicans, latest and greatest conspiracy, type themes that they are always sort of talking about. Who knows what that is about? I haven't heard anything about that until you just mentioned it. And I'm not surprised that Kevin McCarthy would try to create a distraction over what was an utter embarrassment on the House floor yesterday.
All right, Congressman Mark Vesey of Fort Worth, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your time as always.
Thank you.
And now our conversation with Republican Pat Fallon. So you recently voted against the debt ceiling budget deal. Why is that?
Well, I really like the Limit, Save, and Grow Act quite a bit because, number one, it was going to take the debt to GDP ratio from 118%, which is really sky high, down to 106%, which isn't certainly where we want to land, but it's a good first step. This no longer does this. Also, this bill would potentially and most likely increase the debt an additional $4 trillion. And when you're already sitting at nearly 32 trillion, not the best of ideas, considering also that we're spending $400 billion a year just on the interest on the debt. We have to take this seriously. We can't continue to keep kicking the can down the road. And we need to, I really strongly believe, one of the reasons I came to DC is to get us on a path toward a balanced budget.
So, I mean, what was interesting was an interesting dynamic. You had Republicans vote against it. You had Democrats vote against it. You had Republicans vote in favor of it and Democrats vote in favor of it. And so what are people at home supposed to think?
Well, you got the fact that it was an interesting board, as we used to say in the state legislature when we had the 150 members up there, and sometimes it wouldn't just be straight, R's and D's. People vote for and against things for different reasons. I think that some of the Democrats were voting against it because it didn't spend enough. And then a lot of Republicans weren't voting for it and supportive of it because it wasn't a good enough deal to get us on a path toward fiscal responsibility. The fact of the matter is, if we don't address our spending, because we don't have a revenue problem, we take in plenty of money, we just spend more than we take in, that we're going to have a financial Armageddon and fiscal catastrophe at some point. And I'd like to start addressing it now because it's not a Democratic or a Republican thing, it's a math thing.
Well, I wanted to ask you because I was looking at a release from Kay Granger, Congresswoman Kay Granger of Fort Worth, who's chair of House Appropriations Committee. And she said this bill is the largest spending cut in history, over $2 trillion in taxpayer money. And then she goes on to say what she likes about it. It places work requirements for single able-bodied people. It claws back $28 billion of unspent COVID money. It cuts $1.4 billion out of President Biden's request for more IRS agents. It streamlines barriers in environmental permitting, so it's easier to get permits for energy-related projects. She says it funds the levels requested by the Pentagon for defense programs. So what's wrong with that?
Well, that's because I can thank you for bringing those points up, because let's start with the last one first. With the military, it only is allowing growth of 1 or 2% a year, which is far below inflation. So that's in effect a cut. We won't feel it so much this year, but we will in the years to follow. Work requirements for welfare recipients. Well, there's a lot of exemptions in this bill and phase outs. And there's no work requirement at all for folks on Medicaid. And in fact, it increased it's going to increase the number of people that are eligible for food stamps. So that's something that was unfortunately disheartening. The IRS, after this year, about 98% of that spending on the 75,000 new, 87,000 new IRS agents is going to be left intact. And then the student loan forgiveness program, or better stated, the student loan transfer program, folks never went to college, is left intact as well. So those were the kinds of things, and none of those things were in the original Limit, Save, and Grow bill, which I knew we weren't going to get that exactly. We do have divided government. The Democrats are in control of the Senate and, of course, the White House. But I wanted to get a deal that was better and closer, because I think all Republicans could agree that we would have liked a better deal. For some, they were able to vote for it because it was good enough. And for others like myself, it wasn't good enough.
And I wanted to ask you about that, because do you think that the speaker could have held out for more?
I think that Kevin McCarthy was in a really tough position because, again, he's got a very, very narrow majority in this chamber, and the Democrats control the White House and the Senate. So I think if those folks at home that want to place blame, I wouldn't put it at the feet of Kevin McCarthy. I'll give you a little list. I'd blame Joe Biden, Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, and the other Democrats that will not acknowledge that we cannot continue to spend more than we take in.
So considering the framework that, Republicans have 1/3 of, I guess, the legislative process in a sense.
Yeah.
So how do Republicans go forward if the deal wasn't good enough? And I know it passed, but I'm saying to build on that, given the reality.
Well, I think we've been rather united over the last 6 months. And I didn't hear any of the membership on the 221 Republicans that we have complain about Kevin McCarthy's leadership at all. Until this point, there were a few people that were calling for his head. And I thought that was incredibly premature, because we do have 222 representatives from the Republican conference. And we don't always think alike, and that's okay, and that's healthy. So we look at the things, we build consensus amongst ourselves to try to get to that 218 votes, and then we move forward on things that we can all agree on.
So you don't think Speaker McCarthy's in political trouble at all?
I would really hope not. Again, not at this juncture. What are we going to throw out? I mean, are we going to do this to where, this is what I would say to some of my colleagues, if you don't agree with something, a bill, and you vote no and it passes, we're going to need a new speaker. We're going to need 18 to 20 new speakers in the next year and a half. And that's like the, the old style Italian parliament. It's not going to get us anywhere. It's going to cause great dysfunction. And I think it would also cost us our majority as well.
And my last question to you, Congressman, and I thank you again for your time, is what's next?
As far as on the horizon, well, I just got out of a briefing with Ukraine. I'd like to see us address the border, because it's been incredibly porous in the last 2.5 years under the Biden administration. I think that's very important to not only Texans, but to the rest of the country, because Joe Biden has made every state a border state. That's an unsustainable crisis, really catastrophe at this point. I think we should address that first and foremost. Continue to fight for fiscal responsibility, which is a tall order and a large hill in DC, but it's something that's of vital import as well. And I want to make sure that the President of the United States isn't a national security threat. And that's why on the Oversight Committee, we're continuing the investigation on the Biden family.
And on that matter, Speaker McCarthy said that the House will hold the FBI director, Christopher Wray, in contempt if more people, I guess, on your committee, the Oversight Committee, don't get a chance to look at that document. Is that correct?
Yes, and I have not been able to look at that document. I'm a subcommittee chair on the Oversight Committee, and I think I have every right to see the document. The FBI is holding back. So we are going to be in discussions with Chairman Comer today about just this very topic and the best steps moving forward.
And talk to us a little bit about what this document contains and why Republicans are so focused on it.
Well, because it was, for two reasons. One, we want to see what the actual contents are, and it was generated by a highly reliable source. This is according to the FBI, that they've used in the past, that's been highly credible, to use their term. So that in and of itself is going to get your attention. And it's got a great deal of specificity as far as Joe Biden, while vice president, engaged in, and this is the allegation, it was engaged in a influence peddling, $5 million for policy decisions. And again, because it came from a very credible source that's been known to the FBI for, I think, as long as a decade, and they've paid this person six-figure sums, that gets your attention. Number two, we want to make sure that the FBI's done their due diligence and exhausted every lead on this topic, because they are the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigations. We want to make sure they did a full and thorough investigation, and we need equal justice to make sure, and you have to hold power to account, and that's fine, and that's their jobs. But not just do it when a Republican is the subject of an inquiry. You have to do it when a Democrat is the subject of it as well.
And so you want to see if the FBI did an investigation at all, and if they did, what was the conclusion?
Right. If it was thorough, I was asked in an interview a couple of days ago, well, if this lead ends up being a dead one, are you going to end your investigation? And I said, heavens no. Why would we do that? This is one of scores of leads, whistleblowers, documents, suspicious activity. We've got 170 suspicious activity reports that have been generated by financial institutions on the Biden's financial dealings. So there's a lot that circumstantially, I think the preponderance of the evidence is that there was something afoul. It's just a question of how much does Joe Biden know? How much was he involved? Because he's been caught in a lot of lies. I mean, he said in 2019 as a candidate for president that he didn't have any idea what his son Hunter was doing business-wise, and he never met any of his business associates. That's a pretty strong statement. He built that firewall. Come to find out, that there were abject lies. They were completely false. He's met with dozens, if not scores, of Hunter's business associates, and you knew he had an office that was co-located with Hunter after he got out of the when he left the vice presidency. So clearly he had a lot of knowledge. I don't know why he would say that other than he was trying to cover something up.
But the Democrats point out that nothing ties him to getting all this money.
Not yet. I mean, just like Watergate, they didn't instantly know that Nixon had known about the break-in, and that he decided that he wanted to have a cover-up. So that's just it. We're just going where the evidence leads us. It doesn't make a lot of sense that somebody like Hunter Biden, who is by all accounts kind of a derelict adult, becomes a multi-millionaire international businessman, and in the energy fields and energy sectors and rare earth minerals with all foreign entities, until what changed in his life? His father became vice president. So clearly we know he cashed in on the family name, and so did his uncle, Jim. But did Joe Biden know? Because the payments are always very suspicious. They're made from foreign entities into shell companies, into another shell company, and then to a shell company that the business associates control. And then it goes to the Biden family, now up to $10 million. A couple of months ago, we thought it was only $1 million. So now we think it could go up to $30 to $50 million. And here's the last thing. If you have nothing to hide, if I were accused of this and I didn't do anything wrong, the first thing I do is I would release all my bank records to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that I'm completely innocent. But that hasn't happened. In fact, they've taken the exact opposite route, where they're dragging their feet at every turn.
Congressman Pat Fallon from the 4th Congressional District in North Texas, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. God bless.
That's it for Eye on Politics this week. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Jack Fink. You're watching CBS News Texas.